linears, there are exotics that are just as easy to use, do higher DPS, and have similar total damage output. Thunderlord is kind of in the same boat as Heir Apparent, except it's got a dinghy instead of a life raft. Ever since the fixing of its double lightning strike interaction with Divinity's crit, it's clear that this exotic is a rather mediocre one for boss damage, though it does do higher DPS on top of having higher total damage compared to its arc-shielded neighbor on the damage ranking list. This is yet another exotic I'll be adding to the historical tab so that people can compare its pre-nerf damage to existing options, but in its current state, Thunderlord is a bottom-of-the-barrel damage strategy when it comes to endgame scenarios. Next up, we have Taipan 4FR, the craftable void equivalent of Reed's Regret. Remember when triple tap firing line Reed's Regret was everyone's favorite damage option? Even if linears hadn't been nerfed, Taipan would still be a huge distance behind the top options on this list, and even those that would argue for total damage when it comes to linears will struggle to defend them in the state they are in today. To provide some more detail, this rotation actually adds a honed Izanagi shot right before beginning to spam linear ammo, and it also accounts for the fact that enhanced triple tap and a reload dodge after emptying the second mag will allow for a third triple tap proc in the third mag, boosting the total effective reserves to 34. Like I said, these rotations are what an optimal player would do if given these options. Unfortunately, still not enough to save Taipan from taking the 4th lowest spot on the rotations ranking. Coming up on our first traditional rotation, we have Double Pellet Tractor with Rain of Fire. For those unfamiliar, this is just like a double slug tractor rotation, but with pellet shotguns used in order to damage bosses like Oryx, where the crit is out of reach for a slug shotgun. While I knew this rotation was most definitely going to do less damage than a Hunter doing the same thing, this was a useful test to compare the total damage added by using Rain of Fire to reload all 3 shotguns compared to having a Blade Barrage up front and only getting 1 reload of each shotgun through the Dragon's Shadow. For reference, the rotation is simply cycling through all 3 shotguns until all 3 have exhausted their mags, which are 7 shots, then dashing and doing it all over again until all 3 are out of ammo. If you want to see the details on damage calculations, including shot timings for this rotation or any others, check out the rotations tab in the spreadsheet for more info on exactly how I arrived at my damage numbers. For pellet shotgun options, as I've discussed in my other videos, any lightweight with Vorpal is appropriate with preference towards Reese Walker and without remorse. Another infamous linear from the Witch Queen era is Cataclysmic. Boasting the highest total damage of any linear at nearly 5.5 million, this rotation abuses Force times the Charm and Bait and Switch, the best ammo regen perk and one of the best consistent damage perks in the game. Unfortunately, Cataclysmic just isn't up to snuff when it comes to raw DPS, just barely breaching 6 digits. Much like Taipan, this rotation accounts for the fact that you can actually shoot 12 shots per mag past mag 1. Since the last 2 shots in a mag count towards 4 times the charm on the next mag if you shoot the first 2 in the next mag quickly enough. This means that Izanagi's burden is out of the question, since it takes far too long to hone if we want to stay within the 3-second FTTC window. This little quirk allows us to reach an effective 43 total ammo from a mere 23 start, since we're essentially shooting non-stop from the FTTC calculation perspective. Many players grew fond of how good Cataclysmic was during year 5, but its placement this far down in the DPS ranking should let you know just how far we've come since its days of glory, even if the Lightfall linear nerf had never happened. For some of you, this may make you even reassess the Rocket versus linear debate many were having at the time. As you'll see in the rest of the list, Rockets were leagues ahead of linear even back then. The concept with this rotation is the same as Double Pellet Tractor with Vorpal shotguns once again, except the rotation is modified to account for the different mag sizes of Fortissimo, 5 with Assault Mag, and Nessa, 12 with Reconstruction. To sum it up, the rotation goes through 6 Nessa and 5 Fortissimo shots every cycle, starting and ending with Nessa before swapping back to Tractor and then dashing. On top of that, instead of using all 3 shotguns equally, since slugs have higher damage per shot than Tractor, a lightweight-based shotgun, the rotation focuses more on the slugs, only involving Tractor to keep the scientific method uptime and the boss debuffed. Sleeper's pretty straightforward. Most players are at least aware of Sleeper's existence as a decent damage option, and given that it outdoes more popular damage exotics like Thunderlord, it's not a horrible pick either. There are a couple exotics above it that I personally say are better low-effort damage options, but it's an easy-to-understand anchor point that we can use to compare other rotations to 2 times more DPS than Sleeper or something like that. A little lacking in the total damage department, but that shouldn't really be surprising to anyone. Xenophage actually ended up placing a little higher than I expected, higher than Sleeper. But still suffers from its low total damage. Nothing too crazy in the rotation, just a swap to Radiant Dance Machines and using your second dodge right when multi-dodge is about to expire after 21 shots. I feel like a broken record talking about easy-to-use solar exotics that shoot at a consistent rate, as this is the third one in a row, but maybe it's not a coincidence. Anyways, with Whisper being active, Whisper has decent total damage and decent DPS, but nothing worth writing home about, much like everything that came before it. Another benchmark to measure stuff with, though. If you're on the linear train, this is the last stop. Briar's Contempt is as good as linears get when it comes to DPS. A little saddening given that we're not even a third of the way up the list, but let's talk about what Briar's has going for it. The better of the two linear frames for DPS, one of the best damage perks in the game in Enhanced Surrounded, and Enhanced Rewind rounds, giving the gun the opportunity to go through its entire reserves with only one reload. When the topic comes up, I tell people linear didn't need a nerf at the start of Lightfall. In fact, they probably needed a buff if rockets weren't and aren't getting nerfed. And now, hopefully, it becomes clear why. Not only do linears do under half the DPS of optimized rocket rotations, but they also don't even have legitimate claims to total damage either, given just how much effective damage rockets do. Not to be linears while they're down, but the fact that a damage rotation that intentionally sacrifices power weapon damage to provide a debuff for the rest of the team is out-damaging their best candidate is truly indicative of how behind they are in today's meta. This rotation in particular is the same thing as the Warlock version, just with a Blade Barrage tacked in front instead. On top of that, you only get one chance to reload all your weapons, so there's only 2 mags being dumped instead of all the reserves. That being said, the total damage still ends up around the same, so the only time a Rain of Fire rotation would be better is in environments where your Duel player has to be a Warlock. Same deal as the Warlock version, but with 2 reconstruction slugs instead of 1, since hunters don't have the luxury of Rain of Fire. This way, the rotation can actually dump 18 of each slug instead of stopping at 10 or 12, like with Fortissimo. With a recombination Heritage and a Vorpal Nessa, this rotation ends up only slightly edging out Double Pellet Tractor, which is a useful tidbit for more experienced players looking to compare pellets and slugs. They're not so different after all. The rotation order for this one is Tractor, 6 of each slug, Tractor, 6 of each slug, Dodge, Tractor, 6 of each slug again, and then a Tractor shot to finish up. With Enhanced Explosive Light being capped at 7 of the 19 total shots that Regnant holds, this rotation is severely disadvantaged as it progresses past the first 2 Regnant mags. While a more consistent damage perk would lift this rotation a little higher, it wouldn't be anywhere near enough to bring HGLs up into meta contention, especially given that there aren't really any special selling points that HGLs have to offer. For this rotation, the order is 3 Regnant, Wilderflight, then Izanagi on loop until you run out of Regnant ammo. Make sure you hone before rallying for this one, since you'll be using 6 honed edge shots. If you're a Gallahorn user and you want to do more damage than just spamming Galley, this is generally the best option for you, offering around 10 to 15% more DPS while boosting your total damage by around 160%. Sporting a Vorpal Fortissimo and a Frenzy Sojourners, this rotation is pretty straightforward. Start with a Galley shot, then alternate between your slugs for 2 shots each, then repeat. Once you've shot 2 rockets and 8 slugs, simply dash and start over until you end on your 10th Galley shot. Another test by popular request, Two-Tailed Fox is alright when it comes to damage amongst the top 3 exotic power weapon only rotations. Small note though, going forward, a fair portion of the damage rotations will assume that you are able to refresh the multi-dodge timer on Radiant Dance Machines while doing damage. While this isn't particularly hard, one grenade or knife will do the trick, be aware that Two-Tailed Fox will not accomplish anywhere near this much DPS with manual reloads. This rotation simulates the best possible scenario. A player blade barraging a boss, swapping from SES to RDMs mid-air, and then shooting 10 TTF rockets in a row while refreshing multi-dodge in the middle of damage at some point. Merciless has recently gained some notoriety, especially in the low-manning community, where it was used in the world's first solo Nezarec as a burst option during Final Stand. Analyzing its numbers, it's no surprise it's as effective as it is. For a special-only rotation, 2.5 million total damage while maintaining decent DPS is certainly outstanding. While you're certainly not going to be using Merciless as your main damage source anytime soon, it's an excellent use of energy special ammo when you're out of rockets and meshes incredibly well with Radiant Dance Machines, given that you need to get a kill for Impetus anyways. Speaking of which, this rotation was specifically designed around RDMs, to make the most use of Impetus. First, get a kill with Merciless, dodge reload, shoot 7, use your 8th on an ad, dodge, shoot 7, kill an ad again, dodge, and dump the rest of your ammo. Pretty simple, but using RDMs to dodge reload actually noticeably increases the DPS of Merciless compared to manual reloads. Just above Two-Tailed Fox, Leviathan's Breath is another exotic that pans out as a decent DPS option if you're only going for the exotic heavy route. It's easy to use, works on almost any boss, can be used by any number of people in the fire team. Honestly, now that I'm looking at a lot of these damage exotics, they kind of just blend together. At least this one's good against champs. And that reminds me, frame-based damage, including the double damage glitch with this weapon along with tick sources like storm grenades, will be tested at some point in the future too. Finally, we arrive at the last of the 3 exotics I'll recommend to people who want an extremely simple damage option. Acres is pretty decent if a boss is close range, and with Trench Barrel, it has greater total damage than almost anything that comes below it in the DPS ranking. having recently gained a lot of popularity on dungeon bosses over former fan favorite The Lament, which clocks in at around 25% less DPS, Legend of Acres is definitely a safe choice for consistent damage against melee viable bosses. As one of the last single weapon focused damage strategies on the list, Deathbringer marks a special spot. First, a disclaimer, and one that you've probably heard before: if you use this weapon, you will almost definitely not get the damage numbers you see here, as these results assume perfect reload timing with RDMs, multi-dodge refreshing while shooting, and maximum height on every projectile. On top of that, most people know that Deathbringer seems to have an instance projectile limit, where multiple people shooting it will simply delete some of the projectiles, making it a non-starter for boss damage in general. Deathbringer used to be a chart topper when it came to theoretical single weapon DPS charts, and that trend doesn't seem to be changing much when it comes to more extended damage options. This next rotation marks a big divide between the bottom and top half of the rotation ranking. First, not only is there a huge leap in DPS coming up between this rotation and the next, but almost every single rotation from here on out is a rotation in the classic sense, involving swapping of weapons, part of the second and third design categories that I mentioned before. Someone asked me to test Malfeasance with Lucky Pants, and I wanted to see if I could fit it in an actual damage rotation, and fit it did. While this isn't anywhere near the highest damage rotation on the list, it's certainly interesting to see Malfeasance being used effectively in a damage rotation. It does require a bit of finesse. One part of the rotation requires players to kill an enemy with a lightweight knife, to load a Grave Robber Vorpal weapon Aikilos SG and activate Ember of Singeing for a second reload dodge. However, it does bring some very high total damage to the table, especially given how high its DPS manages to be. Dumping Horseman ammo into an enemy has always been a trademark of endgame damage strategies, especially in speedrunning. While this isn't really a traditional rotation, in case you were wondering how much DPS 4 straight Horseman mags ends up doing, this is it. With damage like this, it's no surprise that Dreamwork boosted 20 mag Horsemans were melting boss during the 2022 Solstice, especially given that every shot past 5 had max broadside stacks. Ah yes, the Dragon's Shadow triple rocket rotation. Originally shared to the community by Blazing S-Fire and Achilles, this rotation allows hunters to shoot 3 rockets in a row by exploiting the fact that the Dragon's Shadow dodge reload animation actually shifts the reload itself to the end of the dodge animation rather than the start. Thanks to this quirk, players can shoot, manual reload, and shoot while dodging at the end of the manual reload. By doing this, the rocket finishes loading during your dodge, and a rocket seemingly pops out of your dodging body, and you can shoot another one as your dodge ends thanks to the delayed Dragon's reload. Besides that, everything else about this rotation is pretty standard. Izzy, 2-snipe, rocket, and repeat. Throw in an Ember of Singeing lightweight knife in there and you're golden for another dodge. While this rotation has been overshadowed, it's still a solid pick and a bit of year 4 nostalgia for endgame players. This rotation, minus the fact that it doesn't involve bipod, is about as spammy as it gets. Get this, you're shooting 10 rockets and then 20 horsemen in a row without any interruptions besides reload dodging, provided you can keep multi-dodge up. I don't think another multi-weapon rotation on this list gets better value out of a triple surge than this one. Remember how I mentioned bipod? Yeah, so this rotation shoots not 10, but 15 rockets in a row at bipod buff rates. On top of that, we're taking 15 Envious Assassin stacks into the start of the rotation, meaning we start off with 5 rockets without a single reload. Unfortunately, bipod rockets buffed with Pack Hunter currently do about 48% of the true damage of a bait and switch equivalent, and this is such a huge offset that the increased fire rate and spam factor of this rotation isn't enough to overcome it. While we are taking advantage of the stackable 15% stasis weapon boost from Ballador's Wrathweavers, bipod holds this rotation back enough that it still doesn't surpass bait and switch Apex spam, which we'll see higher up in this ranking. When bipod gets buffed in the coming seasons, definitely keep an eye out for how this one moves. A few of you might recognize this rotation from Warlock's Solo Nezarec and other challenges taken on by D2 players at the start of Lightfall. While Starfire has since been nerfed, I simulated what a pre-nerf Starfire rotation would be like on a boss by having a teammate provide me with Field of Flame, the Verity's grab buff that boosts teammate grenade regeneration. Ever since Starfire was heralded as the best thing since sliced bread for boss DPS, one of my goals with making a video like this became explaining how Starfire wasn't actually broken for boss DPS, but for other reasons. I'll probably explain my thoughts on Starfire in a video related to analyzing armor exotics, but the point is this. Starfire is much like Malfeasance in that they aren't extremely high DPS options when used in rotations. Instead, they are infinitely refreshable filler, which is a useful role in its own right. If you ever need to spread out your rocket use more, but something like Izanagi's Burden or the 4th Horseman would be too quick of an ammo dump, Starfire fusion grenades, much like Malfeasance mags, are fantastic for extending your total damage and time to empty. I used to tell people that Starfire doesn't increase DPS. You actually tend to lose damage by taking the time to throw fusion grenades that do 100k damage when your rockets do 400k or more. What Starfire actually does to a rotation is flatten it out by adding slight dips in your DPS in exchange for using less ammo. It took Bungie nerfing Starfire for a lot of people to detach themselves from its quilty shell, and thankfully it opened the door for people to explore a few of the rotations to come that were already in the game before Starfire's nerf people. That being said, this rotation is still designed to do the highest DPS while still using Starfire fusions to reload a demo rocket, so there is no intentional flattening going on here. It's as simple as Wither Horde, Slug, then a cycle of Rocket Nade, Rocket Manual Reload, only breaking to refresh bait and switch after the 6th rocket. Wait a second, didn't we just do Wither Horde Nade Rocket? But this rotation is a little different. Not only are you juggling your bait and switch timer, but if you still want to do a grenade rotation, Starfire isn't really an option in most cases anymore. In its place, we have Vari's Brow, which is a much more involved damage rotation that requires getting a stack refresh using a solar weapon at least every 10 seconds in exchange for doubling your fusion grenade damage. Naturally, this rotation is only appropriate on some bosses, and also loses some damage by interrupting rocket spam with time for getting stacks. However, you can see that the DPS ends up being slightly higher on top of doing more total damage. Since this rotation is a bit situational, we'll talk about what bosses a rotation like this might be appropriate for in the next video. As our first Needlestorm rotation on the list, we have Izanagi Slug Apex. This rotation is a twist on the classic Izzy rocket swap with Threat of Ascent being used in the mix as often as possible to squeeze extra rockets out as often as possible. This slug can be swapped out for Wilder Flight or a Sniper for longer range bosses, and the DPS shouldn't change too much. Additionally, if consistent threatening grenade uptime is an issue, it can be swapped out for Grapple at minimal DPS loss. While the second half of this rotation is pretty standard, Izzy Slug Rocket Nade Rocket, the first half is a little too specific for me to list it all out here, so if you want more details, look at the rotation tab of the spreadsheet for the specific order of actions. This next rotation combines two popular burst options with a loadout swap. Instead of just including Grand Overture or Parasite by themselves in this list, which would be extremely low total damage and wouldn't really constitute a rotation, I decided to chain Grand Overture, Blade Barrage, and Fourth Horseman spam together. Speaking of Parasite, it's missing because it doesn't really have much use in standard damage scenarios, and it's not particularly noteworthy if you try to do so. There are still some specific instances where it's a good idea, but we'll save those for the next video. As for this rotation, it's got only 3 parts: shoot a 20 missile overture volley, cast Blade Barrage, swap to RDM's mid-cast, and then land and shoot 3 mags of Horseman. When Conditional Finality released and people were ranting and raving about how it was the best raid exotic to come out in a while, I started to wonder whether it could be used in damage rotations. After doing some health bar testing on a lot of the exotics in the game, it didn't look too promising, especially given its aggressive frame, reduced damage in team settings because of shared ignition and shatter procs, and of course its lack of automatic reload. However, I also discovered a few other things through my testing. 1. Conditional Finality is at worst equivalent to another aggressive frame shotgun when swapping, and at best one that does around double damage. 2. Aggressive frame shotgun swapping isn't bad, it's almost on par with lightweight swapping given equal perks, even if it might feel sluggish. And 3. This rotation actually does enough weapon damage that sacrificing Needlestorm for Rain of Fire, something that can reload conditional the other shotgun and your rocket, is actually worth doing. Plus, this rotation is pretty easy to pull off. 4 shotgun, rocket dash rocket on repeat, taking advantage of reconstruction at the start. Even if multiple people are doing this rotation, the DPS is actually still competitive enough that the damage loss of losing ignitions and shatters isn't a big deal. But you should probably have at most one person doing this, especially given the existence of the next rotation. Double Slug Rocket, another classic. If you saw the Double Slug Galahorn rotation, this is pretty much the same thing with Threat of Ascent instead of Rain of Fire, and 5 Slug instead of 4. First half is the same as Izzy Slug Apex 2. So, a disclaimer here. While this rotation might be in the top 3, and it's also the highest DPS rotation that doesn't involve just dumping bait and switch rockets and using Radiant Dance Machines, this is probably not an appropriate rotation for most circumstances. First of all, it does almost equal DPS to Double Slug Apex, but is mechanically much more difficult to pull off, given how tight I've set all the input timings. Additionally, sliding into your teammates during rocket damage, even if you're coordinated, is probably not the best idea. It's still pretty cool to see 7 slideways and ascent rockets dumped in a row, though. Well, if you know anything about the Iranian Dance Machine's changes, you probably saw this one coming. The ability to dump an entire rocket's reserves with a mere 1.3 or so seconds between each rocket, not even accounting for Envious or Reconstruction, is absolutely insane, and boy does it show up in these results. The only real difference between this rotation and the next one is the rocket of choice, and we'll go over why that matters in a second. Atop this mountain of 34 damage rotations lies Cold Comfort, this time not with Bipod. Some of you might be confused. Why does this rotation have over 40k more DPS than the same thing with Apex Predator instead? First, Cold Comfort can take advantage of Ballador's Wrath Reaper's stasis weapon boost, so that's a free 15% on top. Second, Envious Assassin and Restoration Ritual are better than Reconstruction for a rocket spam rotation, since you can shoot 4 rockets in a row instead of 2. Finally, as an aggressive frame rocket, Cold Comfort's firing delay is only 1.1 seconds, whereas Apex Predator's adaptive frame limits it to 1.183 seconds, which makes a small but quantifiable difference in their DPS for the first few rockets, especially that given Cold Comfort is shooting 4 of them in a row. Now that I filled your brain with 34 damage rotations, let's talk about which ones I think actually make sense as default choices for most bosses. While some of the precise values listed above may change over time as I retest options like rockets more and more thoroughly, these suggestions should still be valid for the current meta. For the Titan player's sakes, I'll also briefly explain how these rotations can be adapted to Titans as well. Standard, Izanagi Slug Apex and Double Slug Apex. These two rotations are pretty similar, with one being more appropriate for longer range bosses with the right filler weapons slotted in. The Warlock rotation is already written in, and Hunters would do the same thing, except start with RDM spamming 5 rockets before going back to using Izanagi. For Titans, there's no stowed reload assist, so you'd be opening with a Curious Thunder Crash and then just do regular Izzy filler rocket swaps. Effort, RDM done. If you're a Hunter and you want to put in effort to do the most damage, this is the play for you. You're going to need to learn how and when to kill an ad after you start multi-dodge, but when the boss environment calls for it, this rotation is incredibly high damage no matter what kind of damage phase you're dealing with. Exotic, Legend of Acreus or Leviathan's Breath. 2 options for 2 different ranges. I've already said all I really want to about this pair in the results section, so these 2 picks should be fairly obvious. Just front load with your class's best damage super, Needle Storm, Blade Barrage, or T-Crash, and get to pumping. Other, Tractor and Gallahorn. Since almost every modern damage strategy in Destiny 2 requires a Tractor or a debuff player and someone on Gallahorn, I had to include something for all the debuffers and pack leaders out there. Double Slug or Pellet is typically the way to go in these cases, and they're the only choices listed here anyways. For long-ranged or other unique instances requiring either of these components, like Daughters or Golgoroth, Part 6 should contain any exceptional cases that don't fit shotguns. Learning how to perform damage rotations can be daunting for a lot of newer players, and there's often a stigma against learning how to do damage rotations in general. People seem to think that damage rotations are mechanically difficult or sweaty, when in reality, I can tell you that those that learn and understand how to use them only stand to gain a fun experience in Destiny that they would not have gotten otherwise. First, damage rotations are not particularly difficult. Like anything else in this game, they take practice and familiarity, but they almost never require some frame-perfect input timing or vast knowledge and tracking of cooldowns. Second, damage rotations are also a sliding scale. You can pace yourself and learn something simpler before you want to approach something more complicated involving more moving parts. Finally, there's nothing wrong with learning to love doing more damage, especially in an MMO-style game, and damage rotations will help you get there if that's where you want to go. If I haven't lost you yet, there are a handful of tips that you learn over time using a variety of damage strategies that I've compiled here in order to make your life easier. They are as follows. Number 1. Boost your handling as much as you can using dexterity mods, targeting mods, effects like On Your Mark, and exotics like Ophidian Aspect where applicable. One of the most common mistakes I see newer players make when learning damage rotations is having low handling weapons or inadequate mods, which makes their swaps look so sluggish that it is actually detrimental to their learning process. I get asked how I get my swaps so fast a lot. I cheat using dexterity, targeting, and handling mods. Try it, it's like crack for swapping. Number 2. Use your number of keys to switch weapons if you typically use your scroll wheel, especially for rotations like Double Slug. Number 3. Take your time to aim your precision shots. Think Izanagi and Slug and Sniper, and when you become more comfortable, speed up your rotation. For weapons where you need to ADS to shoot accurately, make sure your crosshair is somewhere near the target before you ADS so you don't need to do as much micro adjustment. Number 4. Practicing in the Enclave or in similar locations is fine, but practicing on a real boss is always going to be better. A lot of people practice damage fine by themselves, but their damage really suffers in real damage environments. Number 5. With Izanagi's Burden, hold R before you start shooting the gun to get an instant hone afterwards. The same also applies for other weapons that you might manually reload. Pressing R as soon as your shot goes out allows you to reload faster than if you tried to continue shooting normally. Number 6. Try not to ADS with any weapon that doesn't need it, like rockets, GLs, or pellet shotguns. Number 7. Remember you can sprint while holding a weapon to instant ready it after a state change. This is especially useful for Izanagi's Burden right after you hone it. Number 8. Use sound cues to learn when your rocket or other auto-loading weapons have loaded. Number 9. Make sure you are close enough to the boss to apply Tracker Cannon's debuff if you are using it, because there is a small range window where a boss may glow purple from being damaged by a Tractor, but will not be debuffed. Number 10. Abuse full auto fire to shoot your weapons as early as possible when swapping to them. Number 11. Learn ready and stow animation canceling using grenades and rain of fire in order to maximize swap speed. Number 12. Use the magazine counter to tell you when you can swap off weapons like Izanagi's Burden, or to know when a weapon is actually done reloading, even though its reload animation may not be complete. Now that was a bit of a lengthy video, but I got a lot of requests to do a lot of testing, and this is the first of the big three when it comes to DPS videos, the other two being part 6 and 7. I hope the ride was at least partially enjoyable to watch, and hopefully the next two parts of this series will release in a shorter time period than this one did. If you have anything you want to see tested or verified in the spreadsheet, feel free to leave a comment. And of course, thanks to everyone who helped with beating up Templar over the past week, including people from my Twitch chat and Discord server. As usual, all clips used in the video that don't belong to me are linked in the description, as well as the quantum damage spreadsheet, which contains a lot of base values that I reference in the video. Damage rotations are one of the most fun parts of learning to become a more competent endgame player in Destiny 2, and through this video, I hope I was able to create and explain a resource that actually addresses two concerns I had with the current state of damage testing. First, other tests in the past have used wipe screen numbers instead of health bar values, which are sometimes extremely inaccurate, as we will explore in part 7. Second, very few content creators cover proper damage rotations, and when they do, the testing isn't comprehensive enough to provide firm conclusions. I wanted to work on this project until I felt that in my heart I was confident about the data I was presenting and drawing conclusions from, and as far as I can tell, I'm pretty happy with what we've got here. Next video, we're going to talk about every single raid and dungeon boss in the game, and discuss why people might use damage strategies that are or aren't on the damage ranking. In the meantime, get to cooking some bosses. In the previous video, we went over how different factors in a damage environment can change how endgame players create optimal damage strategies in Destiny 2. In this video, we're going to apply that knowledge and discuss the most important building blocks for structuring a team around any damage scenario. While this section doesn't have nearly as many elements as the previous video, it's still very important to become very familiar with these core damage components in order to achieve the best boss damage outcomes for your team. Welcome to part 2, Team Structure. First up on our team checklist is debuffs. Debuffs can be applied to bosses in a variety of ways and will cause them to take increased damage from all sources. On top of this, they cannot be stacked, and the most potent debuff will always take priority. Debuffs also fall into two categories: standard debuffs and void weakened effects, introduced with Void 3.0 in Season of the Risen. While for most purposes, weakens can be treated as 15% standard debuffs, there are some bosses that can only be weakened and not debuffed, notably Aatrox from Deepstone Crypt. While it is unknown why this is the case, some players have theorized that it has to do with Aatrox being one of many bosses using proxy entities in order to have multiple damageable instances, much like Crypt Security from the same raid and Fallen Shield from Grasp of Avarice. The most common debuffs used in optimal damage strategies are Tractor Cannon and Deadfall Tether, while less common debuff options include Divinity, Mobius Quiver, Felonar's Helm, Echo of Undermining, Collective Obligation, and seasonal debuff options. Based on some of the considerations we went over in the last section, the debuff you choose might change. By default, most optimal damage setups opt for Tractor, as it is the only reapplicable 30% debuff in the game that does not require a super. On top of this, Tractor users can still do a sizable amount of damage while still keeping full debuff uptime, compared to an option like Divinity, where the debuff player is resigned to exotic trace rifle damage for the entire phase. This sounds great, but if Tractor is so great and all, with its 10-second debuff, insane total debuff uptime and reserves, handling boost, ability to hit immune targets, update health, and do good damage with specials, then why would you ever not use it? Let's talk about some scenarios where it might not make sense to use Tractor by analyzing its disadvantages. First, Tractor Cannon is a shotgun, and shotguns don't have much range. If a boss is very far away or impossible to reach with its blast, then it's simply not an option. For example, players choose to use Deadfall Tether, the next most common debuff, on the Sanctified Mind, because they're encouraged to stay by the non-tethered relay in order to make use of enhanced relay defender mods. If the Tractor player were to try and debuff, they would not be able to reapply the debuff mid-damage without leaving the relay and dropping their damage to almost nothing. Second, while it's not a massive difference, Tractor does decrease the amount of damage players do compared to just doing damage normally. Typically, in 6-man damage scenarios like raids, this isn't an issue, and the exchange of one player's damage for a 30% boost to everyone else is acceptable, especially when you consider the length of some raid damage phases where Tether won't cut it. However, in scenarios where you have less players, having a player use Tractor instead of Deadfall Tether, Mobius Quiver, Felonar's, or some sort of weaken can actually end up being damage loss, especially on bosses where the typical Tractor double shotgun damage method isn't very effective to begin with. Finally, sometimes debuff options are chosen for a utility purpose, something that Tractor may not have, as versatile as it is. For example, Divinity is often chosen in Fireteam Grandmaster Nightfall speedruns as its instant hit scan, practically infinite range overload stun, and massive crit are more useful than Tractor's higher debuff percentage and reserves. Another example, Tractor Cannon occupies the power ammo slot, and while it is very useful, there are times where other weapons take priority. In King's Fall speedruns, for example, teams choose to use Divinity on Daughters, despite Tractor Cannon being a usable debuff on the boss models in question. Why? During the encounter, there is a floater player on a sword with Heat Rises, meaning that no matter what they do, their damage won't be as high as the other players, who are on damage supers or touch a flame with rockets. This player, assigned the role of debuff, has two choices. Dunk the brand and swap to Tractor, wasting precious seconds on a kill that's already below 10 seconds, or run Divinity the entire time, provide a slightly weaker debuff, but remain on a sword and provide a huge crit for the team for that short damage window. This thought process is how the previous video connects to this one. Damage environments are never isolated. There are always considerations that surround decision making when it comes to choosing what to do for damage. A big part of optimizing damage in Destiny is learning what is available at your disposal, including these debuff options, and then understanding why or why not you might choose to use them based on the circumstances you are given. All debuffs have their downsides and upsides, and range, debuff percentage, duration, ease of use, damage potential, and setup time can all play a factor in determining each debuff's viability. On the other side of things, we have buffs. Global buffs are quite similar to debuffs in many regards, with the only major difference being that they almost exclusively affect weapon damage, with the exception of Marksman Golden Gun. By far, the most common buffs used in optimal damage setups are Well of Radiance and Radiant, as they are both extremely easy to use and give a 25% buff, which is good enough for most damage scenarios. Other buffs that are less frequently used include Empowering Rift and Blessing of the Sky, sourced from Lumina or Boots of the Assembler. While buffs used to be much more diverse, the removal of Charge with Light mods from the game in Lightfall simplified them greatly by doing away with specialized options like Lucid Blade and Argent Ordnance, as well as High Energy Fire. Much like debuffs, optimal buffs are also dictated by the previously discussed considerations. While Well of Radiance is the de facto standard, as most Destiny players are no doubt aware, there are some scenarios where it isn't necessarily the best option, much like Tractor Cannon. Let's analyze Well the same way we did Tractor, by looking at its downsides. First, Well is stationary. Normally, that's not so bad, but there are situations where that can be problematic. For example, the Consecrated Mind begins its damage phase right next to a relay, but retreats backwards into the middle of the map, at which point a wall closes off the damage start location. As a result, unless two wells are placed, players will be forced to walk out of the initial well and lose their damage buff if they want to keep doing damage. Instead of having two players on well, which is either damage loss or impossible based on class composition, optimal damage strategies often only involve one well, at most, on top of Radiant from Ember Torches. While damage is typically thought of as a static activity, I did mention in the first video that I'd also be covering other scenarios, like Nightfalls and Sectors. In these scenarios, Well's stationary state is even more problematic. You're not going to have a well to plop down in every room you go into in a GM, and you're certainly not going to have one during most of a sector. For these mobile situations, Radiant in conjunction with Empowering Rift is plenty to keep up damage on champions and bosses. Second, Well costs a super, one that could be used on damage. Much like with Tractor, if a phase is short and there are less players in the fire team, it might make more sense to get a damage buff some other way, so that the Warlock in question can use a super like Needlestorm or Cataclysm Nova Bomb instead. By extension, maybe a Warlock isn't even an option. After all, Well is exclusive to Warlocks. In these cases, generally Radiant is the go-to buff option. Finally, Well's damage buff is only 25%. While there are not many damage buffs above 25%, there are times when it makes sense to shoot for higher. The only really relevant damage buff above 25% is the 35% provided by Blessing of the Sky, most often from Lumina's Noble rounds. Options like Banner Shield sacrifice too much damage, but Lumina and Boots of the Assembler strike a good compromise for the benefit they provide in a damage strategy. In the case of Lumina, the cost is not being able to run another exotic weapon like Izanagi's Burden or the Fourth Horseman. However, with how powerful our legendary damage options have become, even using just a rocket and abilities for damage is often barely any damage loss, so providing the rest of your teammates a 10-second boost over Well can be worth it for short phases. Be cautious though, the longer a phase drags on, the worse Lumina becomes, since eventually you run out of noble rounds to buff your teammates with. In the case of Boots of the Assembler, the cost is not being able to use a damage-related exotic like Ophidian Aspect. While this isn't really a big deal, there's another quirk to Boots of the Assembler which might explain why it isn't used frequently in damage strategies. Unfortunately, Noble Seekers spawn from Assembler Rifts do not target players who are in a Well of Radiance, meaning that said players have to receive the buff early before entering the well. The logistics of this process play out a lot more inconveniently compared to Lumina, but for what it's worth, this option is quite underrated and a little neglected by endgame players, often not even crossing people's minds when they come up with damage strategies. The release of Lightfall affected the damage stacking structure in Destiny drastically, and while it did reduce the number of buffs to choose from, what it really impacted the most was amplifiers. Amplifiers are modifiers that boost damage beyond a single buff and debuff. Before Lightfall, we had Font of Might, Power Rasputin, exotic exclusive buffs like Light Shift, activity mods like Transcendent Blessing, and seasonal mods like Solo Operative. In Year 6 of Destiny, this system has been greatly simplified and condensed, which makes this component of damage a lot easier to understand, albeit less interesting. With the removal of Warmind cells, Power Rasputin is no longer a factor. Font of Might and exotic buffs have both been merged and converted into weapon surge mods, which are now subclass independent and based on armor charge, scaling mod count with damage instead of duration. What does this mean for a Year 6 player? Besides activity and seasonal mods, the only thing that players need to keep track of is surges now. Stacking up to 4 times, surges provide bonuses of 10% to 25% to a single weapon affinity, regardless of slot. Theoretically, it is possible to have 4 surges of every single weapon affinity active at once, but realistically, players doing damage will only have access to 3 total surges across 1 to 2 weapon affinities, since that's all leg armor mod slots permit. Having surges on for damage is a no-brainer, but which surges do you pick? Technically speaking, you can do the math to find out exactly how you should assign your 3 surge choices based on a little proportional problem solving, but generally players will run either 3 surges matching their power weapon affinity, or a 2-1 split between their power weapon affinity and kinetic weapon surge. In a situation where a power weapon absolutely dominates the total damage pie chart that a player is outputting, like in the case of clown cartridge rockets or linear DPS, it makes more sense to run 3 of 1 surge. In other situations where players might be running Double Slug or Izanagi's Burden in conjunction with their power weapon, it makes more sense to distribute surges more evenly instead of taking the diminishing returns from 17% to 22%, going from 2 to 3 surges. While most players are familiar with the idea of weapons influencing surge choice, it is also important to acknowledge the reverse. Because it is optimal to run only 2 surge types at most through leg mods, players are also incentivized to choose energy weapons that match their power weapon's affinity, so that one of the surge mods is doing double duty. For example, players using Apex Predator may opt for Sojourner's Tail or Empty Vessel, instead of other alternatives like Nessus Ablation or Truth Teller in a swap rotation. While this kind of loadout influence is nowhere near as restrictive as it was prior to Lightfall, where weapons and subclasses had to match for Font of Might, it is still something worth thinking about when trying to push for damage optimization. 2 more things about amplifiers I'd like to touch on from earlier. First, it is possible to reach 4 surges of an affinity, but only through exotic assistance. While these exotic exclusive buffs used to provide their own unique amplifiers which stacked with everything, as a result of the Lightfall merge, they no longer stack with the standard leg surge mods. Where exotic options like Mask of Macras used to provide a unique benefit by amplifying damage to targets affected by stasis, on top of providing a stackable arc weapon damage boost, they now provide 4 of both the arc and stasis surges instead. This segues into the second note on exotic amplifiers. While some options were worsened by the surge conversion, some exotics received changes that made them interesting potential options for use in damage scenarios. Of all of them, Sanguine Alchemy is probably the one most worth examining. When standing in any rift, including Wells, this exotic provides 2 surges matching the subclass of the user for free, allowing you to dedicate all 3 of your leg surges to another affinity, most likely kinetic. Assuming your kinetic and subclass matched weapons do about the same damage, this amounts to about a 5% increase in overall damage. While it may not seem like much, if an exotic like Verity's Brow isn't needed for damage, Sanguine Alchemy is a great neutral option that boosts damage for free, provided you have your surges configured correctly. Subclass verbs like Jolt and Shatter, applied through perks like Bolt Shot and Chill Clip, or abilities like Gathering Storm, also play a small role in damage setups, but we'll delve further into this topic when we discuss the current meta in Part 4. Finally, as mentioned in Part 1, depending on the activity or season at hand, certain restricted amplifier mods may be valuable. For example, Transcendent Blessing and Ribbon's Curse are used extensively in Dreaming City damage environments, and Thunderous Retort is a valuable super augmentation mod from the current season's artifact. Exotics in Destiny provide unique benefits that range from quirky, almost aesthetic tweaks to meta-defining, gameplay-shaping changes. Over the course of Destiny's history, certain exotics have cemented themselves as essentials in damage scenarios, and we'll discuss their place in strategizing in this section. Let's start with exotic armor. Exotic armor fills many functions that can affect damage, but nearly all of them fall into the same major categories: weapon uptime, ability amplification, super augmentation, and utility. Weapon uptime refers to exotics that boost stats that improve the effectiveness of weapons. Lunafaction boots boost reload and range significantly, which is especially important for shotgun damage. Ophidian Aspect boosts handling and reload. Rain of Fire reloads all weapons on a short cooldown. The Dragon's Shadow does the same thing, but on a long cooldown while massively boosting handling. Radiant Dance Machines provide rapid true reloads, which can trigger effects like Clown Cartridge. Finally, speed loader slacks provide a 15-second Ophidian-style stat boost to all nearby allies upon a dodge. Ability Amplification is a class of exotics that boost ability damage and regeneration based on certain conditions. Since supers are in a separate category, this group contains exotics that boost grenade and melee damage significantly. For grenade-focused exotics, Heart of Endless Light provides massive regeneration scalers and sizable damage boosts to the remaining two abilities when any ability is active.
That was a cool deck. Let's see if I can fix this deck some better. No, cancel. Copy. So you edit. Alright. Let's take up you. Let's see. You. pushing them down by 1. $42. Down. Alright, so that is typical hand trap setup. Let's test it. Oh my god. I draw 3 maxi them. Oh, it's gonna. It is the shifter. Maxi. So for drawing purposes so far, I've not gotten any. He used the light wings. 5 earth. Lament, Sky Dragon, Punk. You have over 10,000 DPS. Nine true. $10,000 damage. So I could do it like this. One of you, one of you, and I'm going first, interestingly. that's it. That's it. I have completed all my daily missions. Alright, gonna take a raid.